We're continuing in our series in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, the second letter that we have in the New Testament. We've been on this journey now for, hard to believe, but it's like 20 plus weeks. Today's the 21st week. And it's been a while. That in pastor speak, that's like half a year worth of sermons where we've just been in this letter, and it's kind of cool to just take some time and make our way slowly through a letter, picking up on some of the nuance and the different things that are there. And so the last couple of weeks, we've been focusing on a section in Paul's letter to the Corinthians where he's focusing on the topic or the practice of generosity and how that's really a value for the church, and how he has expressed that to the Corinthians before. He's made that a part of his teaching, a part of his expectation. And now he's kind of like a father speaking to one of his children. He feels impressed upon that he really needs to remind them of this because like a parent to their child, they said they were going to do something, and so far they haven't exactly followed through. And again, this is a letter that's not a letter of correction. It's a letter of comfort as a whole. And so if we look at it through the lens of Paul's wanting to be a comforting reminder to them, he's actually doing a stellar job of finding a way to really help them along and say, really, you should be doing this. And so this is our third week talking about generosity. We have a few more ahead of us. But today, you can go to the next slide. Today's some review. I put these slides together for a reason. So our first week, we talked about how generosity, Christian generosity, the generosity in the church, it flows from our joy that comes from salvation. It's not just us wanting to be good people, although that's a noble pursuit, but it's this bubbling up joy that's inside of us because we're so glad that Jesus saved us. And salvation is such a key part of who we are that when we practice the act of generosity, it shows. That shows that that's where our roots are coming from. Last week we learned that generosity trusts God to supply the needs of his people. How many of you know that sometimes being generous costs a bit of money or costs a bit of energy or time? Time's a precious commodity these days. Or I heard one recent person who talks a lot on the internet once said that it used to be the phrase time is money. Now it's that attention is money. That attention is such a big thing that we give. When we give our attention or our focus to a certain thing, that's worth its weight in gold. And so being generous with our attention, isn't that something? Now, anyway, why I say that is because sometimes when it costs a lot of money, sometimes we think that, or I use money just because it's on my mind for some reason, but anyway, when it costs something, there you go. Sometimes we get worried about what's in our supply, like what's in our store. What do we have in reserves? Really, it all belongs to God. And so if he wants us to do something with it, really we should hold that with open hands, like that last song was saying. And so praying for his will, but also practicing trusting God to supply the needs of his people, both for us personally, that as we give, that we would also receive in return. Now, what I'm not talking about is some kind of prosperity theology, whatever thing. Don't go there. But the thing is, what I am saying though, there seems to be this principle that Paul picks up on, that there should be equality in the church. And what he means by equality is that when we are generous, that we are also now open to other people's generosity, and that there's a reciprocal relationship between us in the family of God where we provide each other's needs because we're brothers and sisters. We're not just hoarding our pile of toys saying, no, they're mine. We're saying, like my children do all the time, we're saying like, no, you need a toy? Here's a toy. That kind of thing. But I digress. So that's a review. That's a snapshot of the last couple of weeks. You can go to the next slide. The title for today's message is Gospel Generosity. Gospel generosity. Our passage is going to be 2 Corinthians 8:16 through 24. And the big idea that we're going to be exploring together today is that generosity seeks to honor God with our compassion. Generosity seeks to honor God with our compassion. You can go to the next slide. In thinking about this topic, in generosity, I don't want to overexhaust some of the more common images that get associated with either generosity or hospitality. So I wanted to share this image with you. It's one that I used on a website a while ago. I didn't originate with me, so I give credit to whoever that is on the internet that took that photo. But what's interesting about this photo is that obviously there's a heart in the middle and there's a bunch of hands that make up this picture, right? What I find really interesting is that each of the hands has some amount of paint on it that the photographer or artist or whoever had painted this red heart in the center of this group of hands. But what's interesting is that each and every person shows some paint on their hands, and together, when you look at the whole mosaic of their hands all fitting together somehow, some way, in the moment where the image is captured, you get to see what is communicated is, usually in our culture, the heart symbolizes love or compassion or something like that. What this speaks to me specifically in relation to our topic is that for you and I, in our lives, whether it's just us individually or us as a family of faith, we all practice helps in some way, some compassion-based ministry, something that because we have experienced the love of God, now we show the love of God to other people. And that's one of the reasons why, for us as a church, one of our big phrases in our mission is that we live like Jesus and we share his love. And it's not just one person doing it. Otherwise, that'd be a completely different picture, right? It's all of us coming together with all of our acts of compassion and our drive for showing that compassion, that then you get to see this very raw, very real, put together picture. And so this makes me think of what Paul is communicating to the church in Corinth, of how he's laying before them, he's reminding them how there's this need in the church in Jerusalem. At that point in history, there was one church, but many, many locations. And there was the church in Jerusalem. They were having a hard time, and so Paul felt a burden to say, hey, everybody, let's collect some funds and send it back to Jerusalem so that they can continue on in the ministry there, so that they can have some very practical needs met. It would be a lot like a food share kind of thing here in town, or that where you're providing those helps to people. He's saying, hey, to all these churches along the way, including the Corinthians, we need to help these folks out, their family. And so when you think of like these hands as churches all doing these acts of love, it's like they all have a bit of red paint on them, and they're all put together in this mosaic sort of pattern that gives you a picture of love. But not just any love, God's love. And so, that's just a snippet of what we're going to cover. It's going to be great. So if you have your Bibles, please turn with me to 2 Corinthians chapter 8, beginning in verse 16. If you'd like to follow along on the screen electronically, you are welcome to do that. There's no shame in doing it that way. Let's go ahead and read, picking up in verse 16 of chapter 8. Here we go. Paul speaking to the church. He says, "Thanks be to God who put into the heart of Titus the same concern I have for you. For Titus not only welcomed our appeal, but he is coming to you with much enthusiasm and on his own initiative. And we are sending along with him the brother who is praised by all the churches for his service to the gospel. What is more, he was chosen by the churches to accompany us as we carry the offering, which we administer in order to honor the Lord himself and to show our eagerness to help. We want to avoid any criticism of the way we administer this liberal gift, for we are taking pains to do what is right, not only in the eyes of the Lord, but also in the eyes of man. In addition, we are sending with them our brother who has often proved to us in many ways that he is zealous, and now even more so because of his great confidence in you. As for Titus, he is my partner and co-worker among you. As for our brothers, they are representatives of the churches and an honor to Christ. Therefore, show these men the proof of your love and the reason for our pride in you, so that the churches can see it." The first thing I see in our passage is that gospel generosity moves to protect the church's witness. It moves to protect the church's witness. Last time we learned that Paul was sending Titus ahead of him because Paul planned to visit them again. And he sent Titus, one of his co-laborers, co-workers, and partners, like he just said, ahead of him to make sure that they follow through. Because, as we learned last time, they heard about this need, and they were so eager. Paul even says they were the first to volunteer. They were the first ones to say, "We will help." And so what Titus is doing, I love that he points out the heart of Titus, that God had put the same concern in Titus's heart, that the church's witness wouldn't be somehow tainted by their lack of follow-through, but that they would actually show the good of that eagerness and that willingness to help. And so, with talking about Titus, is for Titus, it was a willingness. It was his own will. So even though God had put that concern in his heart, he volunteered and said, "I want to go. I want to go do this thing. I want to respond to the fact that there's this need, and they need to make good on that need that they said they were going to do, so that what they do matches what they say." And so it reminds me of how when you're a part of a team, oftentimes, there's rallying points where you can have a team meeting. And where usually at those meetings, you'll talk about, hey guys, this is what we're seeing. Here's the mission. Here's, this is how we're doing at accomplishing the ministry that needs to happen, if it's a ministry team or whatever action you're doing. And sometimes within the meeting, as you're going along, there's somebody who volunteers and raises their hand and says, "I'd like to help with that. I know that there's a need there. I would like to help with that thing. And so it makes me wonder, when you and I hear news and opportunities of things happening where there is some help that needs to be met, what's your response? Is it passive, like somebody else is going to do that? Maybe, and maybe that's a fair thing. Maybe you're like, I already got enough on my plate. I'm already going through a whole lot, and that's okay. But also, how many of us are willing to be active? Where you hear about a need, where maybe the team leader, like Paul, he's expressing how, hey guys, there's this need. What are we going to do about it? And Titus volunteers himself and says, I will go. I'll make sure that the churches are following through, especially these Corinthians, because Paul, I know that you have this big heart for them, so I'd like to go. Can I go, please? And that eagerness and that willingness to even help make sure that the helps happen. So for Titus, he was so moved by Paul's confidence in the Corinthians that he wanted to make sure that the church's witness was preserved. And so generosity seeks to honor God with our compassion, and sometimes it starts from that place of just being willing. That place of honor it's not necessarily the action itself just yet, but it even starts further back with the motivation of, God, I want to honor you with this action. I want to respond in love, not out of frustration, not out of anger, not out of whatever, not out of sadness maybe, but really from that place of compassion. And where I think Titus was with all of this is that he had a compassion for these fellow believers. Now, because he was a part of Paul's inner circle, I'm sure he heard a lot of the stories of how the Corinthians were acting a fool. But Paul, you don't know these people. How can we really trust them to follow through? And so maybe there was a little bit of that. But ultimately, so it wasn't, Titus wanting to come to Paul's defense and say, I will vindicate this situation. It was, I want to make sure that God's love is shown and that God is honored through this gift that is given. The second thing we learn about gospel generosity is that it serves the connection we have with God and others. Gospel generosity serves the connection we have with God and others. And so it's interesting that Paul mentions that he's sending these two guys with Titus. Titus isn't just going out Lone Ranger style or lone wolf, whatever, like trying to make sure that this happens on his own. He's bringing people with him. What's fascinating to me is that in God's divine picture of making sure that the scriptures are maintained and that we get to read them for us to apply to our lives today, he doesn't mention their names. Isn't that great? Because some of you could have read that and be like, that's not my name. Whew, I'm good. I don't have to follow through on that. I don't have to have that characteristic. But what does Paul say? He describes them. And the first one that he describes, that Paul and Titus, we are sending along with him the brother who is praised by all the churches for his service to the gospel. Service to the gospel. This begs the question. Paul, in previous letters, he's really clear on what he believes the gospel truly is. But for you and I today, the gospel is really that Jesus saves. and that it's by grace through faith that we are saved from our sin, and that he has given us the Holy Spirit because of our faith, that we can now live a life of godliness and pursue showing God's love to everyone around us. Now, what's interesting is that why the gospel is in there, not just because it's a word in there, but in how Paul describes it. In honoring the Lord, later on in verse 19, that we do this thing that we're doing in order to honor the Lord himself and show our eagerness to help. Paul is setting before the Corinthians this pattern that Jesus really gave the church. That the greatest things we can do is to make sure, first things first, we're loving the Lord and we're honoring him, and that we don't forget about others, because others need Jesus just like we did when we first met him. And so these brothers, and by extension for you and I today, brothers and sisters here today, family, as part of the family, we, like these brothers, can serve the connection that we have with God and others. But how do we do that? Well, I think Jesus gave us a really good picture of this in John chapter 13, where it's the Last Supper, and Jesus is, it's Passover, and Jesus is leading his disciples through this practice of prayers and songs and eating food and saying certain things at certain times, like a good rabbi would, a good teacher to his students would. But then what's interesting to me about the idea of this moment is that he starts things off by washing their feet. And so you don't have to turn there. You can just listen to my words, but or if you want to turn there, you're welcome to also. But John chapter 13, beginning in verse 1, John writes, "It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him." Now, they didn't have socks in those days, and everybody wore sandals, so their feet were gross. Anyway, so he came to Simon, Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter. That's so what my kids would do. Oh my gosh. "No, you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." Ouch. "Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, this is the money part of this passage. He put on his clothes, returned to his place. "Do you understand what I've done for you?" he asked. He was probably a little more gentle than that. He says, "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. Now, if you do these things, you will be blessed if you do them. I know that in the context of 2 Corinthians, Paul is talking about money and a collection, practically speaking. But the way the action is happening, that service to one another, that service of the gospel, is like the Corinthians humbling themselves enough to wash somebody else's feet. And so this makes me wonder, for you and I, are we like that brother who is known for his service to the gospel? And how will we know if we're known for our service to the gospel? I think it's a heart thing. I think it's an attitude, a posture that somebody might have. I think it's also, in very practical terms, it's actually showing up and following through on what we say we're going to do and honoring the Lord that way. I think, in a very practical sense, being known for our service to the gospel is putting into action that heart of compassion that God has put into each and every one of us by faith, so that generosity seeks to honor God, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the God thing to do. And not that we're God's, but that we belong to Him. And we take care of the family. We take care of each other. We wash each other's feet. And so, this brings me to my third point, is that gospel generosity, it proves the transforming impact of Christ's unconditional sacrificial love. Gospel generosity proves the transforming impact of Christ's unconditional sacrificial love. In verse 24, very end of this section, Paul, he's describing, this other brother and Titus and all of that, but then he gets down to this point of why they're doing this thing, why they're checking up on them. And Paul, he points out, therefore show these men the proof of your love and the reason for our pride in you, so that the churches can see it. At this point, it's not so that the people in the outside world can see it. This is all an internal affair of internal business of how the church treats the church. So we're not bad talking our brothers and sisters down the road. We're not saying we got the better thing up here in Corinth and they got the worser thing down in Reedsport or whatever. Worser is not a word. Anyway, you know what I mean. I love you guys. But the point is that gospel generosity, it proves something. I'm not talking about earning, so don't get me wrong. We don't earn that transforming impact. We don't earn sacrificial love, but we're showing that by the impact of our life, just by us naturally being the way we are, that something is impacting us. Is it God's love? Or is it something else? Have we let something poison the well? Where maybe we need to be re-impacted by God's love. Because it makes me think of this picture of this guy taking a picture. Isn't that cool? Because as a photographer, your goal, as I've heard, because I'm not actually I'm amateur at best. Really, all my picture knowledge either is from using my phone or the stuff I had to learn because of streaming church services online. And That's the sum total of it, and I really don't even know. But I know some basic functions, and I think you do too, is that when you're taking a picture, you're trying to capture a moment, right? You're trying to capture what you see. Sometimes, depending on what you're looking at, you adjust the lens a bit so you can focus on a certain kind of thing, right? Or a certain, sometimes, depending on the lens, you can even set it so that you focus on a certain object and right in front of you, and then you fuzz out all the other stuff. It's amazing what people can do with cameras. But for a photographer, their goal is to capture a moment, or just what they see. And what they see is, and what they capture with their picture is proof that something happened, that something was that way. In my mind right now, I'm thinking through all these different scenarios, and I'm sure that you could probably think of them too, where there's situations in life where people can boast about a lot of really big things, or like, oh, you should have been there. There were hundreds of people there. And maybe there were actually like 20 people there. In churches, like one of those kind of scenarios, I kid you not, I was at a church where one of this, like their perspective of like 50 or 60 years prior to me being there was that, oh, there were hundreds of people. We had the best prayer meetings. We had all these different things. And then I looked back at the records and it showed like, okay, there were a few hundred, but there weren't like hundreds of hundreds. You know what I mean? And so, but when you take a picture, you capture this moment where you can, somebody who's looking at that picture can see for themselves that, that is actually what it says. That is, that they said something about it, and now I see proof of it. And so Titus, the brother who is known for his service to the gospel, and the other zealous brother, these guys are going because they're trusted to where when they give an account of something and they report to Paul, it's like, because they have seen it with their eyes, they report to him and say, yep, they followed through. You wrote this letter, you let them know we were coming, and lo and behold, they said they were going to do this, and they actually did. They're growing. It's amazing. And they're being impacted by Christ's love. So for you and I today, this makes me wonder if we were to take a snapshot of our church today, would we be a people who were known for our transforming impact? Like being, like that we would prove that Christ's love had so impacted us that we were now living different, that we were now doing things different, that we were even practicing generosity different, that we would be so impacted by the love of God that our neighbors that we may have had this rift with before, and they may have had like all this kind of ammunition about how we used to act or whatever, but now all of a sudden, like they're noticing a difference. If we were to snapshot us individually, is there that impact? If we were to snapshot us as a whole, is there that impact? In leading churches and getting trained for different pastoral things, one of the questions that often gets asked is, if your church closed down today, would the community even know? Would anybody notice? Now, in Paul's case and in Paul's day, yes, it was true. Sometimes I wonder, like it's really easy in a densely populated place like Portland, where I came from originally and where I grew up, where it's like if a church closed, like of course nobody's really going to notice. But then you have a community like ours, and actually, there's some reverberation that ends up happening. Some of you are here because your church had closed down. And it's a mixed blessing because I love having you here. But I know that you've had some of that hurt and some of that stuff going on. I'm not going to get into the full impact of all of that, but to bring us back around is that for you and I, may we be so impacted by the gospel, by Jesus' love for you and for me, that, man, if we somehow stopped existing as a church here, that people would be like, man, I miss that Anchor of Hope place. They really knew how to love people. They showed that there was a different kind of love there than I get out in the world. May that be what we show, because Jesus paid too high a price for you and for me to not show that compassion, to not show, at least to give back to others the compassion that he has given to us and that we've received from him. Let's pray.